I'm focusing on adaptation because any coherent theory of evolution will be based upon a coherent theory of adaptation. Modern Darwinism lacks a coherent theory of adaptation, and this is because modern Darwinism lacks a coherent theory of life. I've been building a model for adaptation based upon the extended organism idea, and two important principles have come out of this so far. The first is that adaptation is a two-way street. Organisms can adapt to environments, as our conventional ideas about adaptation would assert, but environments also adapt to organisms. That in itself should be no surprise. It cannot be any other way, in fact, and that is our second principle. It's impossible to divide the environment and organism from one another. The organism is inevitably extended. That is to say, the environment and organism are drawn together into a conspiracy of sorts, centered around the adaptive boundary. This is a straightforward theory of physiological adaptation. Our next step will be to build a connection to evolutionary adaptation. There has to be one because physiological adaptation is the foundation of organismal fitness, which is a core evolutionary concept. Organisms are fit because they are well adapted. The connection between physiological adaptation and evolutionary adaptation still is a little obscure though, so let's start clearing away the fog. The connection is memory. A coherent theory of evolution will connect present adaptation with some memory of past adaptation. In other words, present adaptation is informed by the memory of past adaptation. Modern Darwinism asserts that it is natural selection of apt function genes in the past that carries the memory of past adaptation into the present. There's an interesting conundrum at work here, and it has to do with the nature of memory, the past, the present, and the future. If remembrance of past adaptation is what shapes present adaptation, natural selection in the present generation is also forming a premonition of future adaptation. What is present now, later will become past. In the past, the present now was then the future. So memory must have two dimensions. Inherited memory is a remembrance. The memory of the past is shaping the present. Memory, at the time it's formed, is also a premonition. The present will eventually shape the future. Let's restate this in terms of our current understanding of heredity. Imagine that we have a double helix molecule of DNA. The gene is located at a particular location on the molecule. This location is essentially a sequence code of nucleotides, A, C, G, and T, in the familiar code. The gene corresponds to a particular subset of this sequence code, which I've color-coded in green. Here, we're representing the gene as an object, as a tangible thing. The gene is a noun, and like all objects, it exists. Function comes from the familiar transcription and translation of the DNA sequence code. This is function in the present, physiological adaptation. DNA code can also be inherited. DNA can replicate, reproduce, and be passed on to the next generation, where the heritable gene's sequence code can specify function in future generations. This is the realm of evolutionary adaptation. The two-sided nature of memory still is evident here. What we are calling present function in the current generation will be past function in a future generation. To repeat, hereditary memory is thus both a remembrance of the past and a premonition of the future. According to the mutationist theory, that premonition can only change if there is some mutation in a gene, which can be passed on to the future through replication, reproduction, and inheritance to the next generation. When framed in terms of the object gene, natural selection will screen out premonitions of apt function in the future from premonitions of inapt function. This is evolutionary adaptation. You can see that this still is fundamentally a tautological theory of evolution. Past becomes present, present becomes future, and future descends from past. This is literally a circular argument. It lacks a coherent core to hold it together. So how can we break out of this tautology? I will say that the problem arises with thinking of memory as an object. We need to think differently about what hereditary memory is. Let me illustrate the problem with another little thought experiment. This is a photograph of my mother as a young woman, before she married my father. Here's another photograph. That's me in the picture. I was 1 year old at the time. Both of these pictures were taken before I have any memories that I can recall. My first memories only came from a couple of years later. Even though I have no direct memory of these snapshots in time, when I look at these photographs, a huge flood of memories surges up about her, my father, my sister, my aunts and uncles and grandparents, our lives, our struggles, our triumphs and our failures. You'll probably experience the same thing looking at a photograph of your own mother. This tells us something important about memory, particularly hereditary memory. This photograph is just patterns of ink and pigment splashed onto a paper. It's a bearer of memory, but it's not itself the memory. We can call this an object memory. I prefer to call it a memory token, something that you can use to get an actual memory. In the same way, say, a subway token gets you a subway ride, but is not the subway ride itself. Memory tokens evoke actual memory, setting off a flow of information that produces a memory stream, a process. Sensory information is taken in and interpreted. Information is conveyed to the brain, where associations are made with other memories through recall. The actual memory is therefore a process, in short. Okay, what does this have to do with heredity? The notion of the gene as a discrete sequence of nucleotide code on a chromosome is similar to that photograph of my mother. It's an object memory, a memory token. The gene itself is not a memory of anything, any more than those photographs are memories. Rather, the memory is evoked by the processes of activation, transcription, translation, and function that the memory token of the gene opens. It's a process memory. Now, let's remind ourselves of the crucial point. Memory is not simply a remembrance of the past, it's a premonition of the future. Process memory is the past shaping the present and the future. This is the nexus of evolutionary adaptation. How far into the future will the premonition extend? This leads us to a new conception of fitness. Now, fitness derives from the persistence of process memory of apt function. Fitness is persistence? That's a pretty big pill to swallow, and it's quite different from the way modern Darwinism treats fitness. So let's unpack it. Fitness is a core evolutionary concept. Darwin himself had a vague idea of it as success in the struggle for existence. Modern Darwinism is a quite different kettle of fish from Darwin's own Darwinism, however. So let's revisit the question, what precisely is Darwinian fitness? In the modern Darwinian conceptions, fit organisms are those which produce more offspring than do less fit individuals. Fitness, in short, is fecundity. Whatever heritable variation made one type of organism more fecund than other types would then be passed on to future generations. Over time, this would produce new species. Modern Darwinism has committed itself to a gene selectionist mindset. Certain types of organisms could outbreed others because they were genetically endowed to do so. But hidden in there is a commitment to a conception of the gene as an object memory. Let's imagine that we have a chromosome with a gene located at a particular point. Let's get rid of that chromosome because it's gene selectionism that modern Darwinism focuses on. Imagine that we have another variation of that gene. We'll color code this alternate gene in green. Both genes evoke the same function, but they differ in efficacy. Both genes can replicate and be passed on to future generations. Let's imagine that the green gene leaves only one offspring in the next generation while the blue gene leaves two. Organisms possessing the blue variant will be more fecund, in other words. And so it goes, generation after generation, as long as the lineage endures. Those gene variants that leave more replicates will be more fit compared to those that leave fewer replicates. If we conceive of hereditary memory as an object gene, replication is the only logical way to think about fitness and natural selection. Let's suppose, for example, that the organisms that carry one of the object genes or the other survive at different rates. In other words, the mortality of offspring is higher in one of the variants than the other. It's still replication that designates fitness. It may be, for example, that the variant that produces the fewer offspring may actually be more fit because its offspring may be more likely to survive and reproduce themselves. It all seems to tie together so nicely. If you think about it, though, this is a nonsensical way to think about fitness. For one thing, we have that tautology problem again. Fitness is greater replication of genes. Replication is greater in more fit organisms. There's another deeper problem, though. Replication of genes cannot really be hereditary memory. Why? Object genes are not memory. They're memory tokens. And when it comes to adaptation and fitness, it's only process memory that counts. If your concept of evolution turns on object memory, fitness is defined by replication. The more replication there is, the fitter the memory. But object memories are memory tokens. The actual memory is a process. It may be evoked by memory tokens, but memory tokens are not memories. This leads us to a very different conception of fitness, which now can begin to bridge the gap between physiological adaptation and evolutionary adaptation. Let's see how. Here's our familiar standing wave of orderliness. Life exists as a frothy crest of specified orderliness riding along on the standing wave, shown here in green. As we did before, let's change our viewpoint so that we are now looking down on the crest from above. An organism, color-coded in orange, sits riding the crest of the standing wave of orderliness. Within the organism, the memory token of the gene influences the organism's physiology within. But it can also influence the organism's extended physiology, producing an extended organism. The question is, to what extent is the extended physiology itself a form of process memory? As with any process, we have to bring in the dimension of time. The organism has a life cycle from birth to death. The time span between birth and death is the organism's longevity. The organism itself is going to be part of an extended organism. We'll color the extended organism in blue. Here's the question. Does the extended organism have an existence independent of the actual organism? We'll consider two cases. The first is that the extended organism only persists as long as the organism does. In other words, the extended organism has a life cycle that matches the organism's from birth to death. This means the extended organism will have a lifespan with a longevity that's identical to the organism. Once the organism dies, the extended organism dies also. In this instance, both organism and extended organism will come and go in synchrony with one another. Let's now consider a second case. The extended organism involves a modification of the organism's environment. What if that modification was long-lasting compared to the organism? That is, what if the life cycle of the extended organism had a greater longevity than the organism's? To put it another way, what if the extended organism persisted longer than the organism itself? If the extended organism's longevity is longer than the organism's, those modifications of the external environment can be a sort of hereditary memory. It can be hereditary memory because subsequent generations of the organism will be operating in an environment that has been created by its ancestors. No, not just created, that's not the word, adapted. Let me show you an interesting example of such a persistent process memory. It comes from those Namibian termites, which opened the door to my own heterodox thinking about evolution. These termites are incessant builders. This little clip comes from a look inside the underground nest. You can see that the building involves laying down dollops of wet clay. The construction depicted here might look flimsy, but multiply this by the nearly 2 million termites that live inside a colony, and you can perhaps imagine the impressive feats of engineering they are capable of. Here's an impressive example of that impressive engineering in action. This is a time-lapse sequence of termites rebuilding a mound that had been completely scraped off by a front-end loader. Within the space of a few months, the termites have built back their mound to nearly its original height and shape. When we put this sequence together, our purpose was to show that rebuilding of the mound is tied to rainfall events. Look at the video carefully, and you can see that those dark patches appear a few days after a rainfall episode. Those dark patches are moist soil brought to the mound surface by building termites. That the mound is part of the termite colony extended organism is illustrated dramatically by the response of the termites to any injury to the mound. This clip is a time-lapse sequence of what happens when the mound is injured, in this instance by drilling a hole through the mound's surface with an auger. You can see that injury to the mound surface elicits a vigorous response, where termites are mobilized to lay down soil to close up this hole. What's left behind is a kind of ragged, disorganized building, essentially like the scar tissue that forms around a wound in our own skins. Okay, with that background, let's look at another time-lapse sequence. Again, our original idea was to have another time-lapse demonstration that mound building was tied to rainfall events. But we found an unexpected result in this one. Notice this hollowed out part of the mound, here circled in red. This is essentially the scar of a wound that we inflicted on the mound in 2004. This was 1 year previous to when this time-lapse sequence was recorded. At the time we began filming the time-lapse sequence, we were about a month into the rainy season. Now watch what happens as the rainy season progresses. The termites gradually fill in this scar, rebuilding it so that the mound returns to its original shape. Again, this is very reminiscent of the way scar tissue is gradually remodeled in our own skins. Okay, what's interesting here is the mismatch between lifespans of the termites and the time that is needed to make this final repair. Here's a rough timeline of the seasons, from the initial injury to when the time-lapse video was recorded. The initial injury was done towards the end of the rainy season in 2004. This was followed by that year's dry season, which typically takes up about 3/4 of the year. Any remodeling of the scar ceased during the dry season. Eventually, the rainy season of 2005 began, with the scar left over from the previous year now being remodeled again. There's an interesting mismatch here. The lifespan of termites is about 6 to 8 weeks. Thus, the generation that did the initial repair, we'll call it Generation 0, had long died out by the time the 2004 rainy season ended. Several generations of termites came and went by the time the 2005 rainy season started. 6 generations of termites to be specific. It was at this time that the first repairs to the scar were carried out. Thus, the activities of termites 6 generations in the past were influencing the behavior of termites 6 generations into the future. Of all the things termites in the 6th generation could have been doing, their activities were actually being shaped by termites 6 generations previously. This is exactly what hereditary memory does. Hereditary memory biases future behavior. It's a premonition of the future. Treating heritability as a process memory radically changes our understanding of fitness. Fitness is no longer replication of memory tokens, it's persistence of process memory. If hereditary memory is process memory, this vastly expands the range of what hereditary memory can be. I've just shown you an extreme example of this in the case of termite mound repair. The modifications of the mound several generations in the past can serve as a memory that influences the behavior of termites several generations into the future. There's no place in this conception for replication, it's all process. Treating hereditary memory as process memory is what allows us finally to unite physiological adaptation and evolutionary adaptation into a coherent whole. We'll take this up in the next episode.